now to turn to today's lecture, The Tragedy on the Korean Peninsula, by Michael Pembroke, an historian and also a member of the Institute. Educated both at Sydney and Cambridge University, Michael was the son and father of army officers. His father was an infantry platoon commander in Korea and was awarded a military cross for his role in battle described as one of the finest infantry battalion attacks in British history. No mean feat. At university, Michael studied history, French and government, intending to become a diplomat, and instead turned to law. In 2010, he was appointed to a judge of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, and in 2017, he was appointed as a director's visitor of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. In 2016, Michael travels through North Korea, the Uru River on the Manchurian border to the demilitarised zone in the south. Its research is taken in Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, Washington and Cambridge. His current book on the history of the Korean Peninsula, Korea, Where the American Century Began, was released in Australia early in 2018 and has been shortlisted for several various literary awards. So can you please welcome to the podium today Michael Pembroke to talk about the tragedy on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to commence by saying that I've donated to the library a copy of the American edition of the book. It's the American edition because the Americans printed it in hardback. The Australian edition is softback, and I think the American edition is probably a better looking book. It's a delight to be here. I've forgotten when I became a manager. It was some years ago when I wanted to start some research for what became this book, and I met Theo at that time in the old library, who was extremely helpful, and it's clear that she and Paul make a great team. And I met John Hutchinson, who gave me a lot of information. In fact, I have stored away his own writings on his experience in what was the year after my father, 52-53. It's very pleasant for me to meet so many people here who knew my father, still know him, he's still with us, and with whom I've become friends, partly through that association. I'd like to mention Jimmy Jeans in particular, formerly of the British Army and later Australia, and David Lees, who worked with my father at 17 Battalion. And there are others, including one who I've just met, I'll have to check up on. Just remind me, Dave Wilkins, who worked with my father at 2 Battalion at Nogra, which would have been about 1965. Or 65, yes, I remember it well. Although I was only about 9. I should say something about John Hutchinson. My father said last weekend that John's indestructible. My father's more destructible. He's not physically strong enough to come to the city, but he still reads everything. He reads the paper every day. He reads the print versions of your magazine. I don't know how it will go with an online version. I don't know whether he's read my book. My mother said that she won't let him, but it's possible, I suspect, that he's dipped into it. He doesn't really want to remember all of those events. I'm not going to talk about the war as such. The title, The Tragedy of Korea, is a way of introducing for you the 5 years from 1945 to 1950, which sealed the fate of the Korean Peninsula. It's more about the politics than about the war. The war, of course, did not start until 25th of June 1950. I'm going to try and deal, and I'll allow plenty of time for questions, and if you want to ask me questions about the future, you can have a go, but my guess is as good as most of yours. But I am talking about that tomorrow on some television channel. The starting point is Japan. Japan made the Korea a protectorate in 1905. In 1910, it annexed the country and made it a colony. Japan effectively conducted a police state for 40 years, and that was a dark age for the Korean people. But the country was not divided. Japan kept it whole and used the country as a producer of raw materials and a supply of labour. When World War II came to an end on the 2nd of September 1945, the occupation of Korea by Japan was replaced by occupations of Korea by the Soviet Union and the United States. One occupation was replaced by two other occupations. This is not exactly what Roosevelt had in mind, but he died in April 1945. Roosevelt had discussed with Stalin a trusteeship of Korea to help ease it out of its colonial time under Japan and bring it back to independence. That was not agreeable to President Truman or to the hardliners who gathered around him very quickly after he became president. At Yalta, on the Crimea in February 1945, Stalin agreed with Roosevelt to enter the war in the Pacific 3 months after the end of World War II in Europe. As you know, that date was 8th of May 1945, and on the 8th of August, 3 months later to the dot, Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, told the Japanese ambassador of his country's hostile intentions. That was a very busy time in Northeast Asia. On the 6th of August, the United States had detonated the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It would detonate the second bomb on the 9th of August. Close to midnight on the 8th of August, the Russian army, the Red Army, moved into Manchuria on 3 fronts with over 1.5 million men, over 5,000 tanks, and they moved rapidly, extremely rapidly. In fact, a later American historian called it Operation August Storm, with a reference to the First Gulf War. Now, as I said, President Truman did not have the same thinking about Soviet Russia that Roosevelt had. He was sceptical, suspicious, and distrustful of the Russians from the moment he became president. In fact, he'd made his position known about the Russians back in 1941 when he said some very disparaging things during the debates in Congress on Lend-Lease aid to Russia and the UK. So he brought a different frame of mind to the office of president. He and those in the Pentagon and among the Joint Chiefs, when they received intelligence of the Russian invasion of Manchuria and Korea, became very concerned that the speed of the advance would mean that Russia would completely take over the whole of the peninsula before the Americans could get anyone there at all. In fact, the whole idea of the Americans being on the peninsula as some sort of stopper or bulwark against the Russians hadn't occurred to anyone until that night in August 1945. When I say that night, the decision, so we have Hiroshima 6 August, 8 August the Russian invasion of Manchuria, 9 August Nagasaki, 10 August, I might take this opportunity to read something from the book. 10 August we have the decision. The fateful proposal that the Korean nation should be partitioned at the 38th parallel was an American initiative made by a little-known wartime policy committee, the State War Navy Coordinating SWNCC. It was a precursor to the National Security Council. The proposed dividing line was selected on the night of the 10th of August by two young colonels from the State Department working late in the evening. One was Dean Russ, who became Secretary of State some years later, and the other was a man called Bonesteel. They were given half an hour for the task and a map of Asia and adjacent areas, one of those lift-out maps from the National Geographic magazine. It was a March 1942 edition. They were told to work out a convenient dividing line. And a few days later, President Truman confirmed their choice. So we then have the second period in the sequence of events, 1945 to 1948, a military occupation in the south and a military occupation in the north. The military occupation in the south was led by General Hodge, who had the wrong idea from the start, I'm afraid to say. He regarded the Koreans as enemies of the United States, when in fact they were simply victims of Japanese colonialism. And his sole objective was to establish a regime in the South which was supportive of the United States. After a short time, a Korean leader was parachuted in, and there is a great controversy about the legitimacy of him being brought into the country, because the State Department certainly advised against it. His name was Syngman Rhee, R-H-E-E. He was an elderly, anti-communist, anti-Japanese firebrand, and he had one objective, and that was to kick out all the leftists and to secure his country. Some of you may remember Sir Patrick Shaw, who became the Australian ambassador. He became the Australian ambassador to the United States, but before that he was chairman of the United Nations Commission on Korea, and at the time of the events that I'm discussing, he was head of the Australian diplomatic mission in Tokyo, responsible for what was going on in Korea. Sir Patrick Shaw, in a manner which today's diplomats have told me would never today occur, was highly critical about the US-backed regime in the South under General Hodge and Syngman Rhee. He wrote this in a report which one can still read. He said, "Real power is apparently in the hands of the ruthless police force which works at the direction of the G2 section, that's the intelligence section, of the American GHQ and Syngman Rhee. Korean prisons are now fuller of political prisoners than under Japanese rule. The British consulate certainly knew what they thought. They wrote in a note that Rhee was a dangerous fascist or a lunatic. And it's no wonder they thought that the State Department opposed his entry into Korea." Now I mention that because this is part of the origin of the conflict which soon emerged. In the north, I should have added that the establishment of some sort of civil rule, American-supported civil rule in the South, was fraught with trouble and fighting and turbulence and unhappiness. Strangely enough, in the north, the Soviet takeover of North Korea was somewhat smoother. They probably had more experience at it at that stage, and there was far less resistance. And they had Korean-speaking people who were part of their regime. I should also mention that it may have been the North Korean Soviet regime was probably assisted by the fact that a very large number of potential opponents of Soviet rule, Christians, Japanese collaborators, landowners and other political and economic refugees left the country very, very promptly. The most reliable estimate by General Farahokli, the British Korean veteran, is 700 to 800,000 between August 1945 and September 1948. The New York Times, I thought somewhat excitedly, estimated at one stage that nearly 2 million had left North Korea. I prefer Farahokli's estimate. One of the other issues with the administration in the South was that General Hodge's administration was unable to communicate, or had no one who could communicate in the Korean language, declined to use or recognise any existing Korean parties or politicians, rebuffed the People's Committees and outlawed the Korean People's Republic, which was an inclusive organisation and not a communist organisation. I should mention one last thing about that period. Kim Il-sung was, like Syngman Rhee, parachuted into the north. People wonder about him, where he came from and so forth, and it's fair to say that much of his antecedents is obscured by a smokescreen of legend and propaganda and hagiography. I was taken to what I was told was his birthplace, but one can't be so sure about that. What we do know is that he was born in 1912 near Pyongyang and spent the first 33 years of his life under Japanese colonial rule. From the age of 13, he chose a life of exile in Manchuria, fighting the Japanese. By the early 1930s, he was thoroughly radicalized and lived life as a guerrilla in the Kapsan Mountains of Manchuria. His band supported the Chinese in their struggle against the Japanese. By 1936, he had effectively become the leader of the Korean communists in eastern Manchuria, and for a brief time in 1940, he was the most wanted guerrilla in the region, with a price of 200,000 yen on his head. In 1942, a year after Russia was brought into World War II, Kim Il-sung was inducted into the Soviet Army and became a captain in the Soviet 88th Brigade, based at Khabarovsk. Probably haven't been there, it's further north of Vladivostok. It's a cold place, where his unit carried out clandestine reconnaissance and infiltration operations against the Japanese. Well, he obviously succeeded in that role because his attention, the leaders of the Soviet Army and Stalin himself heard about him and singled him out for leadership of the new Soviet satellite to be in North Korea. So we have military governments for 3 years, 45 to 48. In 48, we have a new stage. 48 was the beginning of the two states. Two states came into existence in 1948. The southern state became known as the Republic of Korea. The northern state became known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is a complicated area, but I'd like to try and explain it to you because it's troubling. The General Assembly of the United Nations at the end of 1947 resolved to establish a United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. The purpose of the commission was to facilitate, expedite and observe the election of representatives to a national assembly, which would then convene and form a national government. The United Nations General Assembly was trying to achieve what the Americans didn't want, actually, that is a national government. The Americans didn't want it because they thought that a national government would be dominated by those with affiliations to the Soviets. The resolution specified that its object was the attainment of the national independence of Korea. Well, as I've said in the book, in reality it was a hopeless cause. Despite Washington's ritual incantations about the establishment of a united and independent Korea, those on the ground in the South had no intention of allowing a national entity. Their only interest was in establishing a state in the South which was supportive of the United States. This was, I have to remind you and repeat, at a time when Cold War anxiety was almost at its highest level. Well, it's a tribute to the Australian Diplomatic Corps at the time that they fought back against the Americans. The first one to do so was the chairman of the commission, a man called Krishna Menon, a very well-educated, suave Indian who tried to say as politely as possible that the formation of a separate government in South Korea will not facilitate the objectives of the United Nations resolution, namely the attainment of the national independence of Korea and the withdrawal of the occupying troops. He added that it would be unrealistic to treat any scheme of election in the South as being national. It was a statement of the obvious. Well, he was crucified. He was branded by Washington as a leftist and untrustworthy, and really for no sound reason except that his views were not acceptable to Washington. Then, in February 1948, there was another development when it was necessary for another decision to be taken to implement the process which was going to lead only to a southern state, or the validation of a southern state. The members of the Commission voted on whether they should comply with the directive to achieve that end. And in the records that you can still read for yourself, it's recorded that despite sustained United States pressure, the Australian and Canadian representatives voted against the implementation of the Interim Committee's directive. Their stance was based on the contention that an election that only took place in the South would not advance the cause of Korean unification. They were correct, of course, but as I have explained in the book, Korean unification was not really the American objective. And this was made crystal clear when General Hodge, who was still there as the military commander in the South, denounced the Australian and Canadian representatives for what he called general appeasement of Soviet Russia and for not understanding the bitter Cold War against communism. Now, one can understand the view, but it wasn't an appropriate view. And a little later on, and I thought this was humorous, he complained of pettifogging obstruction where it was least expected, the British Empire. As I mentioned, I've spoken to a number of diplomats about this, including former Australian ambassadors to South Korea, who were all fascinated and said, you know, we just don't talk like that anymore to the Americans. Anyway, the Australian opposition was fruitless eventually. They were overwhelmed by the power of Washington, taken to allow an election in the south, supervised by the UN, which would never come within, which would never, of course, assist in forming a national government, but would serve the interests of the United States. So the 15th of August of that month again, 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea came into existence. Around about the same time, the North Koreans held their own form of election. Soviet elections were not Western-style elections, but the Soviet satellite republic of the DPRK came into existence on the 9th of September, 3 weeks later. 1948. From 1948 to 1950, there was a state of nascent warfare, especially in 49 and in the first 6 months of 1950. The two sides were sparring back and forth across the 38th parallel. Both Syngman Rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north wanted to undo what the Americans had initiated. They both wanted to achieve the reunification of their country, but motivated by different ideologies. Well, as we know, ultimately it was Kim Il-sung who moved first. He moved first because after 48 pleading telegrams to Stalin, Stalin, having agreed on a treaty with Mao Zedong in China, finally relented and was prepared to provide material support for the invasion that Kim had been planning for a long time. In fact, Soviet advisors assisted Kim with the planning for the invasion. Stalin really didn't want to get too involved. He certainly wasn't going to send any soldiers, and his army was staying out of it. He didn't want a bigger fight with the United States. He knew they had the atomic bomb and he didn't at that stage. And Stalin was above all pragmatic and never sought too big a fight that he didn't think he could win. I'm not going to talk about the war too much, but I'm sure all of you know that the war went badly at first for South Korea and the Americans. They weren't quite prepared. The invasion was launched just before dawn on Sunday morning, the 25th of June. It was Saturday afternoon or early Saturday evening in Washington. Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, rang Truman at his home in Missouri, and Truman immediately, because of his long history of anti-Russian antipathy, immediately concluded that this was the first step in a broad Soviet assault on Asia. So Truman flew to Washington DC the next day, and they had a meeting, and one of the first items on the agenda was whether they could utilise their the atomic bombs belonging to Strategic Air Command to knock out Russian installations. A UN Security Council meeting was convened extremely quickly on the Sunday in Washington, which would have been the following day, the Monday in Korea. And this, I think, is a key element of the tragedy. The Security Council resolution, to which the Russians were not a party because of reasons that I won't explain, they were boycotting the Security Council at that stage, resolved that they should call on the authorities in North Korea to withdraw their armed forces to the 38th parallel, go back to where you came from. And then 2 days later there was another even more important resolution by the Security Council, which recommended that assistance be provided, military assistance. to repel the armed attack and restore international peace and security in the area. The key words are repel and restore. So the point of the Security Council's decision at the time of the commencement of the war, exercising its collective power to muster a military force, was to repel and restore and send the North Koreans back to the border. Well, the war, as I said, went badly to start with. The North Koreans pushed all the way down to Busan in the southeastern corner. The Americans had sent a force across from Japan. They had been on occupation duty and frankly they were soft. They were knocked about, and it was only eventually when MacArthur executed his extremely bold, could have gone badly wrong, his bold invasion from the west coast through Incheon with a large body of Marines, that the tide was turned. Now, almost from the beginning, despite the Security Council having decided that there should be a restoration of the status quo ante, there was a very influential body of hardliners in Washington who were not interested in limiting themselves in that way. They wanted to strike a blow against communism, and they wanted to, they were not content simply to push the North Koreans back across the line. They saw the situation as creating a strategic opportunity which would enable them to diminish the size of the worldwide communist bloc and displace part of the Soviet orbit. And as I've said, they lost sight of the limitations implicit in the moral principle of repelling aggression. And there's all sorts of outlandish and exaggerated language that you can read from the time. Rhetorical statements such as, when all legal and moral right is on our side, why should we hesitate? And a bit like what happened in Iraq in 2003, anyone who opposed the crossing of the parallel became guilty of appeasement or a surrender of moral principles. And similar language such as you're either with us or against us was used at that time. Well, there was a pushback and the decision was not finally made, but Incheon changed all that. Incheon was so successful, so wondrous, that there was a euphoria in Washington that resulted in a galloping optimism and, as I've said, killed all sober analysis and launched a dangerous hubris. So, on 27 September, we're now back to where we started. The North Koreans have been pushed back across the border. By the way, China at this stage has nothing to do with it. The Joint Chiefs on 27 September gave instructions to MacArthur, approved by President Truman, which completely ignored the limitations contained in the UN Security Council resolutions. They instructed MacArthur that his military objective was to destroy the North Korean forces. And on 29 September, there's a very troubling cable from General George Marshall to MacArthur, marked for his eyes only. It said to MacArthur, "We want you to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of the 38th parallel." It continued, "It's the evident desire not to be confronted with the necessity of a vote on passage of 38th parallel, rather to find you have found it militarily necessary to do so." And there was another even more revealing message later that day from the Joint Chiefs to MacArthur, telling him to proceed without any further explanation or announcement and let action determine the matter. Our government desires to avoid having to make an issue of 38th parallel until we have accomplished our mission of defeating the Korean forces. It might surprise you to know that the British Foreign Office, who was the greatest and strongest ally at that time, although it was a diminishing force, had not the slightest idea. This was entirely a unilateral decision. Now, I'm not going to dwell on it because it's also a little complicated, but on the 7th of October, a resolution was pushed through in the General Assembly, not the Security Council, which was used as the justification for the entry of the US forces into North Korea. Their object was regime change, and they wanted to take Pyongyang. I'll just say this, the language of that resolution was wondrously loose, and that's someone else's description, or, in the words of a well-known American historian, ambiguous to an absurd degree. Paul Johnson, some of you may know, the British historian, he must be quite ancient by now, said that that resolution on the 7th of October just undermined the concept of the UN as a useful but limited body and set it on a course which transformed it into an instrument of ideological propaganda. Well, I mentioned that the Chinese had nothing to do with the war at that stage. But they soon would join the war because they had warned Washington on numerous occasions that they would not tolerate American forces on their border along the Yalu River in the northern part of Northern Korea. On the 30th of September, Zhou Enlai issued a public warning in language that has been repeated over the years in other circumstances. He said, including via our own Prime Minister, not the current one, but his predecessor, the Chinese people absolutely will not tolerate foreign aggression, nor will they supinely tolerate seeing their neighbours being invaded by the imperialists. It unfolded in this way. So the instructions to MacArthur were first given on 27 September and then again on 29 September. On the 2nd of October, in Beijing, approaching midnight, some sources suggest it was closer to 1 o'clock in the morning, the senior ambassador in Beijing, who was the conduit to the West, a man called Panikkar, the Indian ambassador. I mentioned Menon before. Panikkar was another Oxford-educated Indian diplomat, was summoned to a meeting with Zhou Enlai. Zhou told him that he'd received news that troops had crossed the 38th parallel. He then said to Panikkar, the US troops are going to cross the parallel in an attempt to extend the war. If the US troops really do so, we cannot sit idly by and remain indifferent. We will intervene. So Panikkar went back to his office. It must now be 1 or 2 in the morning. He informed the British. He passed the information on to the Americans. Zhou could not have been clearer and wrote the following words in his diary, which I'll read because they're quite powerful. I should add, Panikkar was not sympathetic to communism at all. He hated the lack of respect that it gave the individual in society. But Aitchison and Truman and those around them immediately labelled him as a leftist, as a mere mouthpiece for Beijing, and they ignored his message. In fact, I won't read what Panikkar wrote because it will take too much time. So the warning was ignored, the troops went through, they got all the way to the Yalu River, and the Chinese entered the war. Now, I'm not going to tell you in detail what happened. Those of you who've read the book will know about the disastrous outcome, the retreat that followed by the US 8th Army was the longest in US military history. And just to pick up on some descriptions by American historians, it was the most disgraceful, the most infamous, one of the worst military disasters in history. It was a rout. And it was very moving for me to describe the fate of the young American soldiers overwhelmed by the Chinese forces who pushed them all the way back below the 38th parallel. Eventually, the might of American power and technology restored the balance along the parallel. That occurred in March 1951. So everything which I've described occurred in the first 6 months of the war. We have 3 months, from June to September, when the North Koreans push south and then are pushed back themselves to the border. And then from October through to December, January, this dreadful retreat by the US 8th Army and also by the Marines on the eastern side of the peninsula, although their behaviour was far braver. Well, I'm going to finish in a moment, because all that I wish to say about the rest of the war, the next 2.5, almost 2.25 years, is that, as John knows and many others know, it was like trench warfare in World War I across the 38th parallel, with infantry patrols going out night after night, making small incursions, coming back, attacks on various points of security, like Marion Sang and a few others, trying to seek to take a mountain or a vantage point, and it went back and forth. And all the time, all the while, from about June or July 1951 to 1953, just over 2 years, there were armistice negotiations going on. There were 375 meetings. There was, both sides were obdurate, but there was one major sticking point which is discussed in the book. And there was also a massive bombing campaign, which I won't discuss, which was also very moving to describe. Napalm, we all know about from Vietnam. It made its name in North Korea. It had first been tested in Greece in 1948, first used in combat there against the communists in Greece, and it was used extensively in North Korea. And of course there were no television cameras to record it, and very few journalists in North Korea, because it was completely unsafe. North Korea became a wasteland behind the lines of which the infantry were fighting along the border. I'd like to end with this note, which is a philosophical note by Simon Winchester. Simon Winchester is not a military historian, but he's a wonderful writer, and we've enjoyed some communications over the years about this book and the previous book. He speculated wistfully that the world might have been a safer place if the Soviets had been given free rein in 1945 to invade all of Korea and be done with it. In that event, there would have been no Korean War, merely a Leninist satrapy in the Far East that most probably, like all the others, would have withered and died, like other Soviet satellite states. Well, we may now be seeing the beginning of the end of what started in 1945. But that's all I wish to say, subject to answering questions. Thank you for your attention.